Florida State's Jermaine Johnson has been rising up draft boards as we approach next week's NFL draft. Is he a good fit for the Jets? We'll talk about that on today's episode of the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Friday, April 22nd, 2022, and I'm your host, John B. from GanggreenNation.com. And I thank you for making the show your first listen or your first watch every day. We are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, hit that subscribe button and you'll never miss an episode. If you're watching on YouTube, please give the episode a big thumbs up. It helps the channel out and it helps other Jets fans find Locked On Jets. Well, this will be our final Prospect Friday show through the offseason. I've tried to give you my thoughts on a prospect who could interest the Jets in the upcoming NFL draft. Next Friday, we're going to be talking about what the Jets did in the first round, and we will be looking forward to rounds 2 and 3 because the NFL draft is now less than 1 week away from beginning. But today I wanted to talk about Jermaine Johnson out of Florida State. He's a prospect who has been rising up draft boards after a strong Senior Bowl performance, after posting some pretty good numbers at the Combine, and he's on the table for the Jets, potentially at 10, potentially even at 4, a defensive end prospect out of Florida State. Played at Georgia before that, had some junior college experience. An interesting prospect, and I'm going to tell you what I think about him today. And through the offseason, I've kind of gone through this format where first, I tell you the things I think the guy does well. Then I tell you about the questions I have about the player. And then I tell you whether or not the player is a good fit for the Jets. I try and avoid this whole idea of whether you like a prospect or you don't like a prospect, because a lot of what it comes down to is context. Sometimes a prospect would be a good fit for one team and a bad fit for another. And the other aspect of this is we don't know how these players are going to develop. There are always guys who are better college players than they are in the NFL, and there are guys who really improve a lot when they get to the pros. So I don't ever like putting definitive labels whether somebody's going to be good or not, because there's so much that we don't know about these players. So instead, I just want to give you an overview of what a player does well, what he doesn't do well. And I have to say, I ended up being much more impressed by Jermaine Johnson than I thought I would be when I examined him. And I'll begin with, and I feel like this is becoming like a running gag when I talk about alignment, but he's got solid length, and having long arms is important when you're playing up front, especially on the edge, because you want to be able to engage with guys without getting too close to them. You want to be able to use your arms to slap their arms away and get leverage. You don't want to have to be too close to them so that they can lock onto you. And Jermaine Johnson has solid length, and I think he also has solid strength in his hands. But beyond that, I see a guy who is a pretty refined pass rusher, I think. A guy who has a lot of moves. He understands how to counter. He understands how to set guys up. He understands how to, fake a step outside to maybe get the tackle to fly open and cut back inside. So he's really solid in all of these areas. And, he had 12 sacks last season. 3 of them were against a team that's, a low-level team. Another 3 were against Miami. We'll get to that a little bit later. Half his sacks came against 2 teams. But I thought I saw a guy whose pass rushing game was more refined than I thought it would be. And beyond that, I think Jermaine Johnson's a really solid run defender. He uses good leverage. He sets the edge well. He kind of he holds the point of attack, which is really important. And a couple of weeks ago, I talked about Trayvon Walker out of Georgia. And one of the things I mentioned, because Walker was not a guy who posted prolific numbers. In fact, his numbers were less impressive than Jermaine Johnson's. But one thing I talked about with Walker is not every scheme is built to accentuate the production of the best player on the defense. Like, I think when you watched Oregon, Kayvon Thibodeau, they built that defense to try and put him in good situations. At least that's what I thought watching him. I never spoke to the coaches at Oregon. Whereas Trayvon Walker was on a defense with a ton of NFL talent and a coaching staff with a pretty defined system in Kirby Smart. So they didn't put Trayvon Walker as their ultimate pass rusher. They weren't trying to just set him loose off the edge to get to the quarterback. Instead, Trayvon Walker had to play more of a defined role. His first job was to protect against the run, and then you get up the field. And there was an article yesterday on my website, ganggreennation.com, by a great writer. He's a Craig. He's been on the show before in past years. He's probably the smartest draft analyst I've ever seen. So the timing of this episode is kind of unfortunate because everything I'm saying today, because I completely agreed with Craig's article, is on ganggreennation.com if you want to check it out. But one of the things he noted was that Jermaine Johnson at Florida State had kind of a similar role where his job was to kind of secure the run. And I mentioned this a few weeks ago with Trayvon Walker. Is there are different roles at the defensive end position. There are some coaches who really want you to focus on securing your gaps before you get upfield and attack. And the example that I used then was Chandler Jones, who posted a lot of very good seasons in New England with the Patriots. But Bill Belichick's a coach who really wants his guys to first secure the gaps against the run and then get up the field. And after he was traded to Arizona, Chandler Jones started throwing up some huge seasons, like 19, 17 sack seasons. Even though he's posting double digits in New England, he wasn't approaching 20. He started doing that in Arizona because they essentially had a different, at least as far as I can tell, they had a different style of defense, which was get up the field, get to the quarterback. And I think that needs to be put into context when you're talking about somebody like Jermaine Johnson, is that you can look at the sack total. And listen, he had 12 sacks. It's not like he was unproductive, more productive than Trayvon Walker was. But, I think there's a tendency to maybe look and say, well, those sacks, 3 of them came against a low-level team. 3 of them came against Miami. That's half his sacks right there. The rest of the season, maybe he wasn't that productive. But you also have to put into context what the role he was asked to play in this defense, which it was not get up the field as quickly as you can. And perhaps the sack totals would have been more prolific if he had done that, if he had been put into a system where he was allowed to do so. But I don't think that's necessarily the worst thing in the world. I think learning to play the run in the NFL before you're in the NFL is a really good thing for a defensive lineman, because I think sometimes defensive linemen come into the NFL and they're kind of undisciplined. They're looking to pad their stat totals. They were put into this system because they were the best player. They essentially were told, don't worry about playing the run. It happens. So I think coming into the game a little bit better rounded, coming into the league a little bit better rounded, is a very positive thing for a guy like a Trayvon Walker. I mean, I look at him right now. I think his game's fairly well refined. It's always a bit of a question whether a guy's going to be able to contribute year one. I mean, when you're talking about guys at the top of the first round, you certainly have a better shot than you have guys drafted round 2. Guys in round 2 have a better shot than guys drafted in round 3, and so forth. But this guy who does a little bit of everything. Again, he's got kind of I think a more refined pass rushing skill set than I anticipated entering the NFL, and a guy who understands how to set the edge. He understands his role within a defensive scheme. It's not just about getting up the field. And that's one of the reasons sometimes you'll see rookies relegated to situational roles, is that they haven't been asked to do a little bit of everything. They haven't been asked to read the play. And so another part of that is that they don't really have a lot of well-defined counters. Well, Trayvon Walker has them, and he has strong hands. He can set guys up, and he understands he can defeat blocks. He can use his hands to get himself free. Guy who really does a little bit of everything. So there's a lot of refinement to his game. I think, that may be a credit to his college coaching. And again, he was kind of all over the place in college. He was at junior college. He was at Georgia, where he got very good coaching. He was part of that apparatus, which turned into one of the best defenses in recent college football history this year without Jermaine Johnson. But a guy who and then went to Florida State and I thought had a very productive season. So a lot to like about Jermaine Johnson. And in all honesty, there's not a lot. I don't think there's a lot to not like about Jermaine Johnson. But ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, I will mention a few of the questions that could potentially exist about his game. That's ahead on this Friday episode, less than a week before the NFL draft. As I mentioned, the NFL draft is less than a week away. That means spring is here. Summer's right around the corner. That means NFL training camps will be opening. And if you go to Jets training camp this year, it'll be in the middle of summer. You'll want to make sure that you have good sunglasses. And you should know that Shady Rays is an independent sunglass company that gives you the features of $200 sunglasses for a fraction of the price. That means polarized lenses, well-constructed durable frames, and premium high-end finishes. Also, something you won't find anywhere else is Shady Rays' insane protection program. Shady Rays includes lost and broken protection on every pair. They will send you a brand new pair if you lose them, no matter what happened. Give them a try, and if you don't love them, you'll pay nothing. It's as simple as that. Plus, 10 meals are donated to fight hunger in America when you shop with Shady Rays. Exclusively for our listeners, head to shadyrays.com and use code LOCKEDON to get 50% off 2 or more pairs of polarized sunglasses. Again, that's code LOCKEDON. It's one word with no space, LOCKEDON, for their best deal of the season. 50% off 2 or more pairs of Shady Rays sunglasses, backed by over 150,000 verified 5-star reviews. And with the NFL draft right around the corner, there are plenty of things to bet on. You can bet on player props, over-unders for when players will be drafted. You can bet on who will be the first overall pick. You can even bet on what's going to happen in the upcoming season. Jets don't have great odds, but if you do bet, make sure you use betonline.net. It's your number one source for all your sports betting stats and sports info. Find all of the latest developments, league reviews, and news, including this year's basketball playoffs and the beginning of the Major League Baseball season. BetOnline is your continued source for all of your sports wagering information, from live betting to playoffs to esports and more. Head to the website or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action. BetOnline, where the game starts. Thank you for making Locked On Jets your first listen every day. We're less than 1 week from the NFL draft, and we're doing our final Prospect Friday show. All offseason, I've been doing profiles on potential Jets draft picks on Fridays. Of course, this is not a comprehensive review. Jets may well pick a player that I have not profiled. Of course, with my luck, that's probably what will happen. But on today's show, we are talking about Jermaine Johnson out of Florida State. And in the first segment, I gave you the things that I think he does well. And I think there's a lot he does well. In this segment, I'm going to talk about some of the questions I have about him. And in all honesty, like I said, I was expecting to be less impressed than I was by him when I really studied him. And I ended up really thinking he was a pretty solid prospect, a very well-rounded prospect. Now, I mean, if you look at him, he doesn't have great bend. So he's not going to be a guy who dips his shoulder off the edge. And to be honest with you, that's not that big of a deal. I mean, there are plenty of pass rushers out there who don't really have that bend. They're not really going to be speed rushers. I know Johnson did do very well at the Combine. In fact, he did very well at the Senior Bowl, too. That's one of the reasons he rose up the draft boards. Maybe that's a question I have about him, because I'm always a little skeptical of the guy whose stock dramatically changes between the end of the season and the draft, because you don't really have game film. Although even then, the Senior Bowl is action against elite prospects. And I do think, like, as much as I'm not a big fan of players dramatically changing their stock, unless there's something like really, really crazy that happens at the Combine, a lot of Jermaine Johnson's stock rose during the Senior Bowl. So even to the extent that I don't love like a player dramatically changing his value after the season, it was actual action in practices that led him to be impressive, that kind of led his draft stock to grow. Now, I guess I really feel like I'm nitpicking here, because I think this is a very solid prospect. I think one area you look at a little bit is, he only did it on the major college stage for 1 year. Again, that's not a huge red flag, though, because he was on Georgia. He was in junior college, but he was at Georgia, which we know Georgia had a great defense this year. We know Georgia was full of NFL talent. So it's not like he was at some small school. It's not like he was at a school with no talent and could not break the starting lineup. I mean, that would be one thing. It's a kind of similar at the wide receiver position. Jameson Williams really had his breakout year this year. Well, before he was at Alabama, Jameson Williams was at Ohio State. He transferred to Alabama. He was on that team with Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave. I mean, there was a lot of guys standing in the way of Jameson Williams. And I kind of think that's something similar with Jermaine Johnson, where he was at Georgia. Georgia was loaded with NFL talent. They built one of the best defenses in college football in recent years. An inability to break through with that lineup, it's not that big of a deal. Sometimes a guy's a one-year wonder. Maybe everything broke right for him his final season. That's not really the case with Jermaine Johnson. So, I mean, even that's not an enormous concern for me. I think, if you're looking for something that legitimately could be a little bit worrying, I mean, maybe it's his age, because he's a little bit old for a draft prospect. And, the way I always look at it, I think age is overstated. I think people say, well, he's not, he's going to be close to his prime. And listen, it's not so much that you're drafting a guy because and you're panicking because you're only going to get 6 years out of him instead of 8 years out of him. I do think there's something to the idea that the level of competition you're playing can matter. So like the example I use is like, say, like on the high school level, a guy who dominates as a freshman is probably more promising than the guy who dominates as a senior, because the guy who's dominating as a freshman is playing against players who are more developed, more better athletes, and he still has room to continue to develop. Same thing in college. So if you have a guy who's kind of an older prospect who's dominating, it might just be that he's more physically developed, because you're still an ascending player in your early 20s. Even like an old college player is still an ascending player. So is he more physically dominant than those players? I think that's maybe something to consider. But again, like I feel like I'm nitpicking right now. I feel like Jermaine Johnson's a really solid prospect, and I will never guarantee you anybody's going to be a great player in this league. But Jermaine Johnson, for me, he kind of checks most of the box. He checks almost all the boxes. I think he's well-rounded. I think his game's well refined. I think he's got the physical tools to succeed. I was left pretty impressed by what I saw on the film, to be honest with you. And I was not expecting to be as impressed. I thought this was going to be a guy I thought was kind of over. I thought, to be honest with you, I kind of felt like I'd feel about Trayvon Walker, which was, I didn't love the prospect. I actually think Jermaine Johnson has everything that you could need to be a really good player in this league. Does he fit the Jets, though? I'll give you my thoughts on that as we close out this Friday episode of Locked On Jets. Of course, the NFL draft is coming up next week, and I got to tell you, if there was ever a protein bar draft, Built Bar would be number one overall. In fact, everybody would be trying to trade up to number one overall to get Built Bar. The only question is, which Built Bar flavor would they get? Which Built Bar flavor would they want? Because there are so many delicious Built Bar flavors. You got mint brownie, coconut almond, but whatever flavor you want, it's delicious, and it's covered in 100% chocolate. At Built Bar, they figure out how to make it delicious, and then they figure out how to make it healthy, and somehow they do both. Most bars contain 130 calories, 4 grams sugar, 4 net carbs, and 17 grams of protein. You can compare that to a candy bar, which usually has around 240 calories, 30 grams of sugar, and dozens of net carbs. Go to Built.com right now if you want to check out all your options. And if you place an order, make sure you use promo code LOCKED15. That's LOCKED15, LOCKED, number 1, number 5, no spaces. You get 15% off your order. Again, it's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at Built, BUILT.com. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Friday. We are profiling Jermaine Johnson out of Florida State today. I've talked about the things I think he does well, which are many things. I talked about the things that are questions for him, which not many. Is he a good fit for the Jets? Now, I think we all know the Jets need that one more defensive end across from Carl Lawson. I'll tell you something. If they get a high-end defensive end from this draft, this defensive line looks really good. I mean, it looks really good because you got Lawson back, you got Quinnen Williams and John Franklin Myers in the middle. You've added Jacob Martin as a situational guy. Maybe even Vinny Curry can give you a little bit as like your fourth defensive end. You really got the makings of an excellent defensive line here if you can just add a high-end defensive end prospect. So after everything I've said, you're probably thinking, well, of course John's going to love the idea of drafting Jermaine Johnson. I got to be honest, I'm a little lukewarm on it despite everything I just said, because I think he's an excellent prospect. I'm just not sure he's one of the top 4 players in this draft, and I'm not sure he's going to be there at 10 for the Jets. I think at 10, he'd be a really solid fit if he's still there. I'm not sure he's going to be. And at 4, I mean, listen, I don't think it's a pick that would have me really upset, but I'm not sure, as good as he is, and this is not a criticism of Jermaine Johnson. I'm just not sure he's one of the top 4 prospects in this class. Hutchinson, you got Thibodeau, Evan Neal, Sauce Gardner, Ekwonu, maybe even Kyle Hamilton in the mix. Is he one of the top 4 prospects? I mean, I don't know. And again, like maybe he's probably a top 10 prospect in this class. So is it really a reach? It's certainly not an egregious reach if the Jets pick him at 4. And you never know. I mean, sometimes the consensus boards are wrong. I could certainly be wrong on this. I've certainly been wrong on plenty in the draft in the past. I just don't know that he's the right fit for the Jets, because if he's there, I mean, the tricky thing is what happens if Hutchinson, Thibodeau go 1, 2, or in the top 3. Then you got Trayvon Walker. I think I'd prefer, even though a lot of people like Trayvon Walker better than Johnson, I'd be more inclined to go with Johnson just because you've got more production there. And again, that's my bias. Sometimes production doesn't really indicate how good somebody's in college is. Sometimes college production doesn't indicate how good somebody's really going to be once they reach the NFL. But I'd probably lean towards Johnson, but it almost feels like you're focusing on one position. It feels to me if you're drafting Jermaine Johnson at 4, you've decided you're getting a defensive end no matter what. And it's not necessarily a bad move because I think he's got a shot to be a really good one. I just don't like that strategy. I think that there are potentially better players available. And I think you already have to do that with the wide receiver position. I feel like 10 almost has to be a wide receiver because of everything else that's happened unless there's some sort of trade. So I understand if they do it because defensive end is a really important position. And again, you are one high-end defensive end away from potentially having a really good line. And this defense is built around the line. And, maybe that can help this unit perform much better this year than they did a year ago. I just feel like there's just something missing there that as much as I think he's a good player, you can be a good player and still not be one of the top 4 players in the draft class. And that's kind of where I'm at with Jermaine Johnson. But, it's tough to go crazy for me if the Jets do pick him because it's like, all right, fine. They didn't get a top 4 player. They got a top 10 player in this class at pick 4. Tough to get upset over that one. Anyway, I'd love to hear your thoughts, though. That's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit that subscribe button. Leave the show a 5-star review if you're listening on a podcast source, and a big thumbs up if you're watching on YouTube. Have a great Friday, everybody. Have a great weekend. We'll be back next week. It'll be draft weekend. We'll talk about what the Jets may do in the 2022 NFL Draft.